Hello everybody. In this video we're going to be looking at the Mosaic Covenant, and all that term means is the covenant that Yahweh, the Lord, enters into with the Israelites through Moses at Mount Sinai, pictured here. But first, before we arrive at Mount Sinai, I want to have us just briefly look at a few challenges that the Israelites face. They have to start traveling through the wilderness already after they cross through the Red Sea and before they arrive at Mount Sinai to make this covenant with Moses, with God. So the challenges involve how will we eat? Where are we going to get our food? How will we get water? How will we defend ourselves against potential enemies like the Amalekites that attack the Israelites along the way? And the answers, I think briefly here, are, well, they first involve what we simply have to trust in Yahweh to provide and to protect us through the wilderness. And the answers then involve, as the Israelites trust in God, manna. God sends manna from the heavens and quail to feed them. He makes water come out from the rock after Moses is instructed to strike the rock for water to come out. And he gives victory over the Amalekites, maybe a story some of you are familiar with, where Moses, as long as he has his hands held up the whole time, he is able to, the Israelites are able to win the victory over their enemies. So in each case, as they're in the wilderness, trust in God. He'll give you food. He'll give you water. He'll give you victory over your enemies. And finally, then, the Israelites need to submit to God's, Yahweh's instructions and his rule instead of Pharaoh's rule, instead of Egypt's rule. Once they arrive at Mount Sinai, you can say there's sort of a change of master. We no longer serve Pharaoh. We left him behind. We need not to now submit to our new ruler, Yahweh. So what route do they take? Real briefly, we might check this out more in class together too, if you have questions. But there are a few different routes proposed for where are the Israelites traveling. Mount Sinai is traditionally located right about here. So in the Sinai Peninsula, this is called, southern little point here, typically, traditionally, where Mount Sinai is located. But you see on this map here, this key, there's the southern route, the kind of traditional one, if Mount Sinai's here. There's also the central route, where maybe Mount Sinai is somewhere over here in the land of Midian. Remember, Midian is where Moses fled after he killed the man in Egypt, and where Moses meets God at Mount Sinai with the burning bush scene. So maybe it's actually more in this area. Maybe, others have said, it's actually through the north here. We really just don't know. There's not enough evidence to fully for sure say this is where the Israelites were. So maybe actually the Red Sea, which you see kind of the two fingers of here, the two arms of the Red Sea, maybe the Red Sea is better translated, some Bible scholars say, as the Sea of Reeds. So Yam Suf is the Hebrew for that. Sea of Reeds, a possible translation. And if it's a Sea of Reeds, it's maybe not the Red Sea, but one of these reedy, marshy lakes more up here in the north. They're kind of hard to see on this map. And maybe the lake itself that the Israelites possibly crossed dried up after this canal, the Suez Canal, was put in to connect the Red Sea with the Mediterranean Sea over here. So maybe we can't really locate exactly where it was that the Israelites crossed anymore, but it's at least an intriguing, kind of fascinating possibility. Maybe it wasn't the Red Sea that we usually call it, but the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf, up here somewhere that the Israelites miraculously crossed. Now, at Mount Sinai, God meets with the people then. He meets with them at the mountain in order to make Israel into a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, Exodus 19:26 says. So this kind of links back to the promise that God made to Abraham, which we should be familiar with by now. Back in Genesis, all nations will be blessed through you. And so why call them a kingdom of priests? Think of it this way. Israel is going to be like priests. And what's the job of a priest in the Old Testament? To bring the presence of God to all the people, to all creation, and then to bring all of creation's worship, all the nations' worship, back to God. So we've used the analogy of a lifeboat before, right? Think of it as a lifeboat. Think of Israel as a kingdom of priests now, God calls them. They're to be the ones who stand in the middle between God and the nations, and between the nations and God, to bring his presence to everybody. How are they going to become a kingdom of priests, though? So how is this promise that was made to Abraham and now coming true with the Israelites as a nation, how is that going to come true? 4 steps I want you to remember. If you obey my laws, if you follow my instructions, which begin with the 10 commandments and then follow with the rest of the laws that are based on these first 10 commandments, if you follow those, I will then bless you. Other nations will notice your holy example as kingdom of priests. They'll notice the blessings that I pour out on you for obeying, and they'll want to worship me, Yahweh, as God too. I think that's what we see throughout the rest of the Old Testament now. That 4-step process is what's supposed to happen. Doesn't always happen very well, but that's the idea. What happens, though, if Israel breaks the covenant? This is something that's important to note. Remember, with Abraham, God had promised an unconditional covenant. So remember that day in class that we mentioned, this ritual with the animal halves on either side. God alone, as this flaming torch, this smoking fire pot, he alone passes through the blood in the trench saying, I will take the blame, not you, Abraham. If you can't keep up your end of the bargain, I'll still take the fall for it. Now, though God has graciously saved the Israelites from slavery, it was God, he's the one who did it all. Old Testament never says, it's important to point out, that we have to ever try to earn our salvation. No, God saves us. God saved the Israelites from slavery. They didn't save themselves. Now, though, he also still expects their obedience. So the covenant with Abraham was unconditional. Even if you break it, I'll take the punishment. But if Israel now fails to keep up their end of the deal, if they don't follow God's instructions like God commands, then, Moses says here in this ritual, your blood, the Israelites' blood, will be shed. So in Exodus 24, verse 8, Moses actually takes blood and he sprinkles it on all the people. So blood is, again, the way that we know a covenant's been signed, it's been sealed, and by sprinkling the blood on all the Israelites, he's saying, you do have to keep up your end of the bargain, the covenant here, or your blood's going to be shed. So how do we put these two together? God promised to Abraham, I'll take the blame. Now he's saying to the Israelites, your blood will be shed if you don't follow me how I want you to. I think you can kind of put them together with this verse from James. James 2:26, a lot of you probably know this verse, faith without works is dead. So yes, to Abraham and to the Israelites, God ultimately is the one who, through his grace, saves us. But we are then called to respond to that grace with our whole lives, right? To take up our cross like Jesus, who died for us. We need to now follow him fully and consistently. And I think that's what God's trying to say to the Israelites at Mount Sinai here. I saved you, yes, and I'll ultimately take the punishment for your failure to follow me. But there still are consequences, and you and I still need to understand that today, right? We need to still follow God fully, consistently, completely. So, a bride. I want you to think about this image here. At the signing ceremony, Israel becomes God's bride because of this kind of imagery of a wedding, right? Think of a covenant ceremony of a wedding where blood doesn't seal it, but rings do, like my wife and I. Cute picture, right, in our wedding here. The prophets, because of this, they often call Israel's idolatry, their worship of other gods, adultery or prostitution. And you can look up these examples if you want. We'll look at some in class too. But Israel, you are now God's covenant bride. You need to stay faithful to him, just like husbands and wives are called to be faithful to each other. And just like you and I today are called the bride of Christ as the New Testament covenant community of God. So the husband, Mount Sinai, God's presence, the bride, the Israelites entering into a marriage of sorts with God here, pledging themselves to each other. And then just to kind of conclude, how can we sum up God's covenant instructions to his bride here, to his covenant people? The 10 Commandments we've started to look at a little bit already, and I think you can sum them up. 1 through 4, love God. 5 through 10, love your neighbor as yourself. And we'll look more at why that might be specifically, and I do want you to think about that a moment. But Jesus calls these the greatest 2 commandments. They sum up everything. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of the following laws are really based on this, and all of them have this special emphasis as we wrap up here. You need to love the poor especially, the widow, the orphan, the alien. You are not to be like Egypt. God wants to get rid of Egypt's influence on Israel. You're to be a community where you love your neighbor as yourself.